local pastor now facing continuous sexual assault of a child. According to official documents, Robert L. Carter repeatedly raped a young family member, even impregnating her.
Tonight, her father is speaking only to our Devin Clark, who is live outside of HBD headquarters with further details. Devin.
I got to tell you, this warrant states that the rapes started when this girl was just 7 years old and lasted well into her late teens, happening at least 600 times with a felony charge now filed. The alleged victim's father is speaking out, but we do want to warn you, what you're about to hear may be extremely disturbing.
She had been around this monster since she was about 6 years old.
This man asked not to be identified as to protect his daughter's identity. That isn't stopping him from speaking out about this man, 39-year-old Robert L. Carter, who he says was a family member to his daughter.
He's always been big to her, and I had realized that she'd been fearful.
The man, whose profile on the Black Preachers Network website has him listed as a bishop and senior pastor, is now an accused rapist.
I don't understand, how you can carry yourself, walk around preaching the word and living, a lie.
According to Carter's arrest warrant filed last month, the abuse began back in 2008 when the victim was 7 years old. It states he would go in her room and make her perform a sex act on him on a nightly basis.
How? How could you even get aroused? It doesn't make any sense.
The warrant states the abuse got worse over the years and that it would happen in multiple locations, including their home when everyone was asleep, Carter's grandmother's home, and behind an H-E-B in the parking lot before dropping the victim off at school. The document also states that Carter would bring the victim here to the Greater Bible Way Church in Sunnyside, where he had an office, and rape her.
She's had an episode where she ended up in the hospital. For psychiatric reasons.
The warrant states she secretly had Carter's baby.
What if she would have died that night? She has a baby in the closet by herself. And he came and got the baby and took the baby to a fire station and dropped the baby off.
With many questions, we went to Carter's address listed on the warrant. But no one seemed to be home, so we called him.
The person you are calling is not available. Record your message at the tone.
No answer. While the warrant has been filed, we understand that Carter has not been taken into custody at this time. As for the baby mentioned in the story, the father you heard from says his daughter is in the process of trying to get the child back. Reporting live outside of HBD headquarters tonight, Devin Clark, KPRC 2 News.
The call came in late just past midnight. A baby barely hours old had been left at a Houston fire station. No note, no explanation, just silence. No one knew where the child had come from. No one knew who had carried that life into the world, only to abandon it in the dead of night. For weeks, the questions hung in the air, unanswered, until one day a girl, no longer a child, not yet a woman, found the strength to speak. And when she did, the truth tore through an entire community like a wrecking ball. She had been carrying a secret for nearly a decade, a secret she never asked for, a secret that was forced upon her. It started when she was 7, a child in a home where she should have been safe. A child in a church where she should have been protected. But there was no safety, no protection, only him.
By subscribing to this channel, hit the notification bell icon so you won't miss our latest videos.
Here at home today, a Houston area pastor made his first official court appearance. Robert Carter is accused of raping a child hundreds of times for more than a decade.
Our Michelle Choi is at the Harris County Criminal Courthouse with the very latest.
We first told you about the disturbing allegations Robert Carter is facing yesterday. Today, the state requested his $200,000 bond remain in place, and the judge agreed. Handcuffed and wearing an orange jumpsuit, Robert Carter was brought into the courtroom around 10 this morning. The 39-year-old suspect is charged with continuous sexual abuse of a child, a first-degree felony, and continuous sexual assault of a child. He's accused of raping a family member more than 600 times over the course of 12 years, according to prosecutors. They say the abuse began when the victim was 7 years old and lasted until she was 19 and took place at Carter's home, churches he worked at, and a grocery store parking lot. They say the victim secretly gave gave birth to Carter's baby in a closet when she was 16 years old, and Carter dropped the baby off at a fire station in 2018. On that same day, KHOU covered a story about a firefighter finding a baby that was left at a fire station. No word yet if this is the same child. Today in court, we learned the victim's child has since been adopted. The prosecutor in charge of the case tells us DNA testing comes next to determine the paternity. The prosecutor didn't talk to us on camera, but she did confirm Carter is a pastor and the victim's family member. She also gave us a statement saying, "Too often, people in positions of power abuse and take advantage of people that trust them. I look forward to allowing the complainant's voice to be heard." We also heard from Carter's attorney.
When he learned of the charges, he turned himself in so he can clear his name. And we'd ask before there is a trial that he be presumed innocent, that people can keep an open mind and hold to him the constitutional presumption of innocence.
Bond conditions were also set for Carter. If he makes bond, in addition to wearing a GPS monitor, he's to have no contact with the victim, and he has to stay away from children, including his own for now. Back to you.
Robert L. Carter, pastor, father, preacher of faith and virtue. A man the congregation trusted, a man they called leader, a man who for years carried out unspeakable acts under the same roof where families gathered to pray. More than 600 times, that's what the case file showed, more than 600 instances where innocence was stolen, where trust was shattered, where silence became a prison. She endured, she obeyed, she stayed quiet because what choice did she have? But the body tells its own story, even when the lips refuse to speak. And at 16, her body carried the evidence. A pregnancy that could not be hidden. A child conceived in violence, brought into the world in the darkness of a closet with no hands to help, no voice to reassure, no mercy in sight. And when it was over, he came, took the baby, walked out the door, left it like an afterthought. Then he returned to his pulpit, to his followers, to the lie he had built brick by brick over the years. He preached of righteousness. He called himself a man of God. He stood before his congregation and dared to speak of virtue, all while knowing the truth of what he had done. And when the truth finally caught up to him, when the weight of his crimes came crashing down, he stood in court facing a jury and pleaded not guilty. Even then, with the truth laid bare, with the world watching, he refused to acknowledge the life he had destroyed. This is more than a crime story. This is a warning, a reminder of the darkness that hides in plain sight, of the voices that go unheard, of the systems that fail those who need protection the most. Because this is not just the story of one girl. This is the story of too many. 7 years old, that's how old she was when it started. At 7, a child should be learning to ride a bike, playing with dolls, falling asleep to bedtime stories, but she wasn't. Because there was no childhood, not the kind she deserved. Instead, there was a man who wore the title of pastor, father, protector. A man whose words carried weight in his congregation, whose voice filled the church with scripture and sermons. A man who preached salvation to his followers while stealing the innocence of a child. It started small, a lingering presence, a voice that called her into rooms where no one else was, a hand that guided her, stayed too long, moved too far. She was too young to understand, too small to fight back, but as the months passed, the pattern became clear. No one else saw it, no one else heard. And soon, the world outside her home, outside the church, began to feel like a place she no longer belonged to. Because how do you cry for help when you don't have the words? How do you explain something so monstrous when the monster is the very man who leads prayers, who shakes hands with neighbors, who stands before a congregation as the voice of righteousness? She tried to resist. She told him no, but what is a child's voice against the force of a man who has already decided that no does not exist? And so it continued. For years it continued. Every time the house was quiet, every time the doors closed, every time the church emptied. 600 times, that's what the reports say, 600 times he took away her right to choose, her right to be a child. And no one knew, or maybe they did, maybe there were glances, hushed whispers, fleeting suspicions, but no one spoke. Because who would dare accuse a pastor? And so she bore it alone. The bruises, the silence, the confusion of a life that should have been filled with innocence, replaced instead by a nightmare that stretched on for nearly a decade. Until one day the nightmare grew into something she could no longer hide. She was 16 when she realized. Her body had changed. The sickness in the mornings, the way her clothes no longer fit, the quiet, creeping understanding that she was carrying a part of him inside her. But who could she tell? Who would believe her? She knew the answer. Oh, and so she did what she had always done. She endured. The months passed, the secret grew, and when the time came when her body could no longer contain what had been forced upon her, she had no choice but to face it alone. No doctor, no hospital, no hands to hold, no voice to tell her it would be okay. Just a closet, a dark, cramped space where she muffled her screams with the fabric of her own clothes, where she bled into silence, where she brought life into a world that had already failed her. She could have died that night. She should have been in a hospital, surrounded by care, by warmth, by safety. Instead, she was on the cold floor, a newborn gasping for breath beside her. And then he came, the man who had caused it all. He took the baby, no hesitation, no remorse. He wrapped the child in blankets, turned and walked away. She never saw that baby again. And when she found the strength to ask what had happened, the answer came without emotion. "It's gone," he said, just like that. But the truth was waiting, because secrets, no matter how tightly buried, have a way of rising to the surface. And soon, the weight of his crimes would be impossible to ignore. For 16 years, she had lived with a truth too horrifying to speak, a secret carved into the walls of her home, echoing through the halls of a church that claimed to stand for righteousness. She had done what she was forced to do. She survived. And then, she wasn't alone anymore. There was a child. A life that should never have come into existence this way, a silent witness to all that had been done to her. But the moment the baby was gone, something inside her changed. The years of submission, of fear, of silence, cracks had begun to form in the foundation of her suffering. The weight of it all pressed down like a boulder on her chest. She had done as she was told. She had endured what no one should ever have to. And yet she was still suffering. She started to break. The panic attacks came first, then the sleepless nights, the weight loss, the hollow look in her eyes that no one seemed to notice. Or maybe they did, maybe they saw it but didn't ask. Because asking meant knowing, and knowing meant doing something. And doing something? That meant confronting a truth that no one wanted to believe. But even silence has its limits. One night the breaking point came. She was found curled up in a ball, shaking, unable to speak through her sobs. Her father's voice cut through the noise, demanding to know what had happened. He saw the terror in her eyes, the way her body trembled, as if even breathing was too much to bear. And then the words came. One sentence. A sentence that would turn their entire world upside down. It was him. Those 3 words changed everything. Her father's world tilted on its axis. The man he had once respected, the man he had trusted around his daughter, was a predator. Disbelief warred with horror. Anger fought against the overwhelming sense of betrayal. And then the pieces started falling into place. The late-night whispers, the way she flinched at a voice that should have been familiar, the moments of hesitation when she was asked if she was okay. The truth had been hiding in plain sight, and now it could no longer be ignored. This wasn't a misunderstanding, this wasn't a mistake. This was monstrous, calculated, unforgivable. For the first time, she wasn't carrying the weight alone. The walls had been breached. The secret was out, and soon Robert L. Carter would no longer be the man standing behind a pulpit. He would be the man standing on trial. The confession had left a wound in the air, one that couldn't be ignored, one that would never fully heal. The father stood frozen, his mind struggling to grasp the weight of what he had just heard. His daughter, his child, had spent nearly a decade in a prison no one could see, and the man who put her there, a man he had once respected, a man who stood in front of a congregation, holding a Bible in one hand while carrying a secret too sickening to imagine. His blood boiled, his breath turned shallow. The house was too quiet, the walls felt too close, and suddenly it was all too much. He needed proof, something solid, something undeniable. And so he asked the question no parent should ever have to ask. How long? The answer came in pieces, each one more horrifying than the last. Since she was 7, hundreds of times. At home, in the car, at church. And then the final blow, the pregnancy, the birth, the baby he had never known existed. His hands shook as he gripped the edge of the table. His mind ran through every interaction, every moment in that church, every Sunday sermon where Carter had stood at the pulpit, speaking about morality while his own sins festered beneath the surface. The truth had been buried for years, but now it was clawing its way out. The decision wasn't difficult. There was no hesitation. There was no room for second guessing. He picked up the phone and called the police. And just like that, the walls of Robert L. Carter's world, the call set everything in motion. The detectives listened carefully, their expressions unreadable, their hands moving swiftly over their notepads. The officers arrived at the house within the hour. The questions came quickly, efficiently. They needed facts, details, anything that could be used to build a case. And then, for the first time in her life, she told her story. Every moment, every violation, every sickening, unbearable truth. She spoke through tears, through pain, through the weight of years spent in silence. And when she was finished, the lead detective nodded once, closed his notebook, and spoke the words that would change everything. "We're going to get him." The news spread fast. A pastor, a man of God, charged with one of the most unthinkable crimes imaginable. The congregation didn't want to believe it. Some called it a lie, a mistake, a smear campaign. Others, those who had seen the shifts in Carter's behavior, the uneasy glances, the moments that never quite added up, knew the truth had finally caught up to him. By the time Carter was arrested, his face was already plastered across every news station in Houston. The headlines were unrelenting. A trusted pastor accused of sexually assaulting a child more than 600 times. A teen girl forced to give birth alone in a closet. A baby abandoned at a fire station like an unwanted burden. And the man responsible? He walked into the courtroom in shackles, his head held high, his expression unreadable. But then came the moment that no one could have predicted. Robert L. Carter, a man whose sins were written in his victim's tears, in the evidence that could not be erased, stood before the judge and pleaded not guilty. Not guilty. 2 words that sent a shockwave through the room. 2 words that left the victim's family gripping their seats, their jaws clenched, their bodies trembling with anger. 2 words that meant this fight was far from over. Because now there would be a trial. Now the world would hear every painful, brutal detail. And Robert L. Carter? He would have no pulpit to hide behind, no faith to shield him, no more lies to protect him. For the first time in his life, he would be forced to face the truth. The courtroom was packed, rows of wooden benches filled with faces, some familiar, some strangers, each of them waiting, watching. Some were here for justice, others for answers. The girl sat near the front, her hands gripping the fabric of her sleeves. She had spent her life in silence, carrying the weight of a crime she never asked for, a nightmare she had endured alone. But today she would not be alone. Across the room, Robert L. Carter sat in a crisp suit, his shoulders squared, his expression carefully blank. He had spent years standing in front of a congregation, delivering sermons with conviction, speaking about right and wrong, heaven and hell. But today, he wasn't the one speaking. Today, he was the one being judged. The charges were read aloud, each one hitting the room like a hammer striking metal. Aggravated assault resulting in pregnancy, endangering the welfare of a minor. The list went on, and still, when the judge asked him how he pleaded, his voice didn't waver. Not guilty. There was no gasp from the crowd this time, no whispers of disbelief, just a suffocating tension that spread through the room. He wasn't admitting to anything. He wasn't going to make this easy. The prosecution was ready. They had spent months preparing, gathering testimonies, analyzing evidence, constructing a case that left no room for doubt. The girl's statements, the DNA tests, the medical records, the abandoned baby, every piece of evidence pointed to one man, Robert L. Carter. And yet the defense had their own strategy. They called it character assassination. They painted the girl as confused, troubled, unstable. They pointed to her time in psychiatric care, her struggles with trauma, as if those things could somehow make her story less credible. They called Carter a man of faith, a respected leader, a loving father of 4. They spoke of his years of service to the community, his dedication to the church. They brought in congregation members who swore that the Robert L. Carter they knew could never have done this. But the facts spoke louder than the testimonies. The girl was placed on the stand. The courtroom fell silent as she adjusted the microphone, took a deep breath, and spoke the truth she had been forced to carry for so many years. She told them everything. She told them about the nights she spent lying awake, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. She told them about the first time, when she was too young to understand what was happening. She told them how it became a routine, how the abuse followed her through the years like a shadow she could never escape. She told them about the pregnancy, about the night she gave birth, alone in the dark, her body racked with pain, her screams muffled by fear. And then she told them about the baby, how it was taken from her before she even had the chance to hold it, how she never saw it again. Tears slipped down her face, but her voice didn't break. Shit, she had broken enough already. Now it was his turn. The prosecutor's questions were direct, careful, unwavering. They led her through the darkest moments of her past, giving her the space to speak, to reclaim the voice that had been stolen from her. And then came the moment that changed everything. The prosecutor held up a sheet of paper, a DNA test. It confirmed what the world already knew. The baby that had been left at the fire station, that helpless, nameless infant, was Robert L. Carter's child. For the first time since the trial began, Carter's mask slipped, his jaw clenched, his fingers tightened into fists. There was no escaping the truth now. No sermon could undo the evidence staring him in the face. The weight of the room shifted, the jury members sat up straighter, the judge watched him closely. Everyone was waiting. Would he finally admit it? Would he finally confess? But Carter didn't say a word. He just sat there, silent. For a man who had spent his life preaching to a captive audience, this was the first time no one wanted to hear what he had to say. And when the trial resumed the next morning, it was no longer a question of if he was guilty. It was only a question of how long he would spend behind bars. The trial wasn't just about one man's guilt, it was about something far bigger. Who gets believed, who gets protected, and who gets left behind. The courtroom held more than just a jury and a judge. It held a community divided, one half demanding justice, the other unwilling to believe the truth staring them in the face. Some of Carter's followers refused to accept what was happening. To them, he wasn't a criminal, he wasn't a predator, he was their pastor, their leader, the man who had baptized their children, prayed over their sick, guided them in faith. They sat in the courtroom, hands folded, heads shaking in defiance every time his name was spoken in the same sentence as sexual assault. This is an attack, some whispered. This is the devil at work, others insisted. Even as the evidence piled up, even as DNA results proved his connection to the abandoned child, there were still those who refused to accept that the man they had trusted could be capable of such horror. Why do communities protect the accused while the victims are left fighting to be heard? Why is it easier to believe in a lie than to confront an uncomfortable truth? Because the truth is messy, the truth is ugly. And in churches, in tight-knit communities, in places where reputation and image are everything, the truth is often the last thing people want to face. The legal battle was just beginning, but the damage had already been done. The girl at the center of it all, she wasn't just fighting for justice, she was fighting against a system designed to make her doubt herself. She had already spent years being ignored, years wondering if her suffering mattered. And even now, as she sat in that courtroom, she watched as a man who had stolen everything from her was still afforded the presumption of innocence. The very system that was supposed to protect her had already failed her once. Would it fail her again? The case had been set in motion, the evidence was there, the testimony had been heard. But this wasn't just about one trial. It was about the hundreds of thousands of survivors who never make it this far. The ones who are too scared to speak, the ones who do speak and are ignored, the ones who never see their abuser in handcuffs, never hear the words guilty in a courtroom, never get justice at all. The statistics paint a brutal reality. Most sexual assaults are never reported. Of the ones that are, only a fraction lead to an arrest. And convictions? Even rarer. Why? Because the burden always falls on the victim. Because even in a case like this, where there's a child, a pregnancy, a baby abandoned in the dead of night, there are still people defending the man accused. Because justice moves slowly, and in the space between accusation and conviction, survivors are left waiting, hoping, wondering if speaking out was worth it. And that's where this case stands now. A courtroom, a jury, a community watching, a man who still claims innocence, a girl who knows the truth, and a question that lingers in the air, pressing down on everyone in that room. Will justice be served, or will silence win again? Outside the courthouse, the weight of the case extended far beyond its walls. The media had seized on every detail. The community, once divided, was beginning to fracture even further. For some, the evidence was undeniable. For others, the image of Carter as a spiritual leader was too deeply ingrained to be shattered by the truth. It didn't matter how many testimonies they heard. It didn't matter what the science said. They couldn't reconcile the man they thought they knew with the reality of what he had done. And so they clung to the only defense they had left, innocent until proven guilty. As if the absence of a conviction would rewrite history. As if a lack of legal guilt could erase the suffering of the girl who had already endured more than anyone ever should. And so, the waiting continued. The world watched. The jury deliberated. And in the silence that stretched between now and the verdict, one question lingered. Would justice prevail? Or would this be just another story of a predator walking free? The end was coming, the jury was deliberating. Soon the courtroom doors would open once more, and a verdict would be read. And in that moment, two futures would hang in the balance. The man who had spent years standing behind a pulpit, speaking to the faithful, holding the trust of an entire community, and the girl who had spent years in the shadows, suffering in silence, waiting for the world to finally hear her. One of them would leave the courthouse with their life forever changed. The only question left was, the courtroom was still. No movement, no whispers, just a crushing silence that seemed to stretch endlessly as the jury filed back into their seats. For days they had listened, they had watched, they had seen the tears in the victim's eyes, heard the words that should never have had to be spoken, they had studied the evidence, the DNA, the medical records, the timeline that could not be explained away. And now, after hours of deliberation, they had made their decision. But before the words could be spoken, before the judge called for order, before the world could hear what would happen next, one pair of eyes met another across the room. The victim sat, hands clenched together, her breath shallow. Across from her, Robert L. Carter sat motionless, his face unreadable. For the first time, he was powerless. For the first time, the man who had controlled every moment of her life for nearly a decade had no say in what would happen next. For the first time, he was the one waiting in fear. In that room, two possibilities existed. One where justice was served, one where it slipped away. The law does not promise closure, it does not promise healing. A verdict would not undo the past. It would not erase the nights spent locked in fear, the years spent carrying the weight of an unspeakable secret. But it would mean something, because in a world where so many survivors are forced to watch their abusers walk free, where justice is a rare and fleeting thing, a guilty verdict would send a message. That she was heard, that she was believed, that the years of suffering, the fear, the silence, it had all led to this moment. But then there was the other possibility, the one that had happened too many times before, where the evidence was strong but the verdict was weak, where the doubt cast by a skilled defense team was enough to tip the scales, where the words "not guilty" rang out in a room filled with pain, and the weight of the decision fell not on the accused but on the survivor who dared to speak. The one who would be forced to live with not only what had been done to her, but with the knowledge that the man who had done it would walk free. She could not control what happened next. She had done what she could. She had spoken her truth. Now it was up to 12 strangers to decide what that truth was worth. Outside, the world waited. Reporters stood on courthouse steps, cameras at the ready. The news had spread beyond Houston, beyond Texas. It had reached the screens of people across the country, across the world. Some were watching because they wanted justice. Some were watching because they wanted proof that justice was still possible. And some were watching because they wanted to see the system fail. Because if a man like Robert L. Carter could walk free, it would confirm what so many already feared, that the system was never built to protect people like her. That power always wins. That silence was safer than the truth. And so the world waited. The cameras rolled. The doors to the courtroom remained closed. And inside, a verdict sat on the lips of the jury foreman, waiting to be spoken. A moment that would change everything. For the accused, for the victim, for every survivor watching. Would justice be served? Or would this be just another case where the truth was not enough? The foreman cleared his throat. The paper in his hands trembled slightly. A single sheet that held the weight of a young woman's past, the fate of a man who had spent years avoiding accountability, and the question the world had been waiting to have answered. But no words came. Not yet. The judge shifted in his seat. The prosecutor leaned forward. The defense sat still, their expressions measured, betraying nothing. For a brief, excruciating moment, the world stood still. The silence wasn't just in the courtroom. It stretched beyond these walls into the homes of those watching, into the minds of survivors who had been following every step of this case. They had seen this moment before. Different cases, different names, same waiting game. Because the truth isn't always enough. Because the scales of justice don't always tip in the right direction. Because sometimes, even when the evidence is undeniable, the system still fails those who need it the most. And so, she sat there, her hands clenched in her lap, her breath shallow, her pulse hammering in her ears. She had done everything they asked. She had spoken, she had fought. Now she had nothing left to give. The decision was no longer in her hands. But then, something changed. The judge spoke. His voice was calm, firm, deliberate. A delay, a procedural issue, more time needed. A verdict, but not today. The courtroom rippled with movement, a sharp inhale from the prosecution, a subtle exhale from the defense. For the girl at the center of it all, it was another punch to the gut. Another night spent wondering. Another morning waking up with the weight of the unknown pressing against her ribs. Because the truth had already been delayed for years. Now it would be delayed again. And what did that mean? Would the system do what it had failed to do so many times before? Or was this the pause before the final reckoning? Outside the courthouse, the waiting continued. The cameras captured the faces of those who had sat through every hearing, every motion, every painful retelling of events. The father who had nearly collapsed when he first learned the truth. The family members who had wrestled with guilt, with shame, with the unbearable question, could we have stopped this sooner? And then there was her, the girl who was no longer a girl, the survivor. She did not speak as she walked through the doors and into the daylight. She had already said everything there was to say. Now all she could do was wait. And so the world waited for justice. Waited for the system to prove that it was capable of delivering it. Waited for the moment when the words would finally be spoken, the words that could set things right or leave another scar in their place. Would justice come? Or would this be another case that faded into silence? For now, there was no answer. Only waiting. And for survivors everywhere, waiting was something they had already done for far too long. This case is far from over. The verdict is still unknown. The battle for justice continues. But one thing remains clear. This is not just one story. This is the reality faced by countless survivors around the world. The truth is out there, waiting to be heard. And that's why we tell these stories. To bring awareness, to expose the hidden horrors that thrive in silence, to remind every survivor watching you are not alone. If you believe in bringing these stories to light, don't let this be the last one you hear. Subscribe now to stay informed, to hear the truth, to make sure these stories are never forgotten. Because when we listen, when we speak out, when we refuse to look away, we make a difference.